Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am fighting a little bit of a cold, so excuse my voice. It's going to sound a little raspy, but I have something today that has been challenging me and hopefully will challenge you as well. But it's this idea that sprinting a marathon is dumb. Now, I haven't ran a marathon before, over and a half. I'm running a full here in a couple weeks. But what I've learned throughout my running experience, which I started a little over 2 years ago, really hit home with it last year and was dedicated to it. What I've learned is that, man, you're supposed to be smart with the way that you run. You're supposed to be smart with the way that you do life. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure they say that 80% of your runs, as you're training for a marathon or really just in general running, 80% of your runs, maybe even higher, should be at a really slow pace in order to build up your endurance. Which shows me, hey, you've got to be smart with the way that you do things. When I was in high school, we ran for baseball, and it was always kind of like sprints, or they were trying to really just test us to see if we were willing to go that distance. And so the way that I understood running was all about just run as fast as you can for as long as you can. And so I would remember going to the gym every once in a while and doing cardio to start or to end at whatever. And like, yeah, I'm just going to get a mile in. And so I'd go on the treadmill and I would do it as fast as I could. Not a good idea. I'd wear myself out, I would tire myself out, and really that's why I didn't start running before, because I hated it. I hated running because I thought that running meant that I had to go out and go as fast as I can as for as long as I can. And the reality is that when you do it that way, it ends up hurting you. It ends up wearing you out, it ends up making you exhausted. And man, sometimes we just need to go slow. Sometimes we just need to know our pace, know the way that we do things, and really walk in the pace of God. God isn't someone who is always sprinting around trying to get things done or do anything like that. God actually rested as he created the world. He rested on the seventh day, not because he had to. He's all powerful, all knowing. He probably could have continued to work on that seventh day, but he said, "No, I'm not going to. What I'm going to do is teach my people what it looks like to rest." I don't know about you, but I've gone throughout moments and periods in my life where I have sprinted and sprinted and sprinted, and I've come close to moments of burnout, being exhausted. I know that there's been moments where I've been exhausted. A couple of weeks ago, I went out and ran a half marathon just in training, and I was going to run it slow, but I felt good that day, so I tried to run as fast as I could. And I appreciated being able to test myself because I was able to run a PR. But that day after, or like got home and didn't really fuel as well as I should have when it come to eating, but I was exhausted the rest of the day. Like it was miserable trying to get through the rest of the day, which takes me away from a lot of other things, right? It takes me away from family time, it takes me away from doing other things. But last week I ran 15 and a half miles, which was the furthest that I've ever ran at a lot slower of a pace. And I was able to do everything that I was supposed to do the rest of the day. Like, yeah, I was tired. Like, it's okay to be tired, but I wasn't exhausted. And I believe there's a difference. Like, when you go and you sprint something, yes, it might be really good for the moment. And sometimes in life, there are moments where you need to sprint to get something done. That's what it was for me that one day. I wanted to see what it was like, I wanted to test myself. But sometimes we need to take a step back and be calm. And we need to take a step back and relax and just go slow. There's a song that I love right now called Slower I Go by SEU Worship. And it talks about this idea of the slower I go, the faster I arrive. And I've learned in my own life for that to be true. Because in my own plan and my own desires of what I want for my own life, I will try to sprint and sprint and sprint and say, man, I need to be here by 25. I need to be here by 26. I need to be here by 27, 28, 29, 30. And I sprint trying to make those things happen. But if the things that I want aren't in God's plan, then it doesn't matter how hard I sprint. And so God says, hey, trust my timing. Don't exhaust yourself. Don't work yourself to death. Just trust that I've got it all figured out and go with my plan. The slower I go, the faster I arrive. The slower I go, the faster I arrive. And so, I've run here in a couple of weeks, running a marathon. I'm not going to go out and sprint the same way that I would a mile to test my time. Like, I'm going to have to slow the pace down. It's going to be a long journey in order to get to the finish line. And so I've got to pace myself. I've got to realize, okay, there's 26 miles here. And mile 1 is a lot different than mile 5. And mile 5 is a lot different than mile 10. And mile 10 is a lot different than 15. And 15 to 20. And I don't know what it looks like beyond that. Really, 15 and a half is the furthest I've gone. But I know that each mile is going to have its own challenges. And so I don't need to exhaust myself in mile 1 because then I won't be ready for mile 26. It wouldn't work that way. And in the same way in life, we've got to be careful about sprinting as hard as we can, as early as we can, because we don't want to burn ourselves out and we don't want to ruin ourselves before we can even take the step into what God has for us. Can God work through that? Of course He can. But I also believe that He wants us to slow down our lives so that we don't get distracted, so that we don't overlook things or overlook people or overlook our families or the things that are really important to us. He wants us to slow down, see opportunities, pay attention to opportunities, and do everything that we can to see the people around us because God has placed you right where you need to be in this moment. And so pay attention to the opportunities that He's given you because if you don't focus now, then mile 26 is going to be really, really difficult. So slow down. So make sure you pace yourself. Understand that you have to take moments. There's going to be seasons that are slower. There's going to be seasons that are faster. But recognize and know that God has you where He wants you to be in this moment. And what He's asking of you is, are you going to be faithful where you are? You may not be where you want to be right now. You may not be where you thought you were going to be at your age or in your career or whatever. You may not be there yet. And that's okay because I have you right where I need you in this moment. Listen, life isn't a sprint. It's a marathon. And it takes training, it takes work, it takes intentionality. Like most people can't just go out and run a marathon. It takes weeks and weeks and weeks of training and intentionality to be able to do those things. And when it comes to us having a successful life and completing the finish line of life means that you and I, we have to slow the pace down a little bit and we have to be smart about it. We have to be intentional about it. We have to train about it. We have to train. And God wants us to know that we don't have to sprint, but we need to enjoy the journey. We need to enjoy the journey because in the journey and in the wilderness is where we start to learn about who God is. I think about the Israelites who were in the wilderness. They weren't able to sprint to the promised land. God had them in the wilderness for 40 years. But I'm telling you, in those 40 years, they learned the lessons that God wanted them to learn. And then eventually they were able to take the step into the promised land. I love looking at the journey of the promised land in the wilderness to get there because there were so many obstacles. They were in slavery, and then they were at the sea that parted, and then later on they get to the Jordan River. This is like 40 years or so in, and what happens is they get up to this moment where they're at the Jordan River, which is close to the promised land. They're getting so close. Moses has died at this point, and he's not leading the people anymore. And so he's given it to Joshua. And Joshua, who was Moses' aide, is now the leader leading the Israelite people into the promised land. And so they come to the Jordan River. I love what it says in Joshua chapter 1, because 3 or so times it reminds Joshua and his people, be strong and courageous, don't be afraid, and remember that the Lord, that I am with you. It's repeated multiple times. And in the Bible, what we know is that when it's repeated, it's important. And I would say that if there's that many reminders in one chapter, or really 11 verses, that we really need to pay attention to it. That's Joshua chapter 1. If you go to Joshua chapter 3, they get to the Jordan River, and yet here is another obstacle. But they knew that God was with them. Again, they could have tried to sprint through this wilderness moment, but they had to sit in the midst of it. They had to sit throughout those 40 years to learn things, to grow in order to get to these moments. But they get to the Jordan River. And in the Jordan River, it said that it was in flood stage, which means that it was going fast. If you look at the Jordan River, usually about 100 feet in width. At flood stage, it can get up to a mile in width. Usually it's 2 to 6 miles per hour regular flow. Now it's 10 to 12 plus, which means that it's not possible for a human to get through. And they said the flood stage can last for up to 2 months. But God had a plan. They've already been waiting for 40 years. They've already been waiting for 40 years. But it says, take the Ark of the Covenant, which is something that God had them build to remind them of God's presence. Take the Ark of the Covenant, go step into the water. And it says that, I love the word picture here. It says, as their feet touch the water's edge of the Jordan River. Remember, at flood stage, it is flying by. Like, it's one of those floods that if you step foot in, it's going to take you out. But it says, as you touch the water's edge, when you do that, the waters will stand up, and you all are going to be able to walk through on dry ground. This is massive. Because if they're walking through on dry ground, I mean, they couldn't have done it without it. They had chariots, they had kids, they had horses, they had, animals, whatever, trying to get through to the promised land. But what I find interesting, they're getting close to the finish line of their marathon. They're 40 years in the wilderness, getting close. And here is an obstacle. What they had to be reminded of is that God was with them, even in the midst of the obstacle, even throughout the long journey of the wilderness. God never left them, but he reminds them because it says, take the Ark of the Covenant, which is the presence of God, and step foot in the Jordan River, which again, you should look it up. Look up Jordan River at flood stage. It's crazy. And once you do that, the water's going to stop, and I'm going to provide a way for you to get through. I'm going to provide a way for you to get through. If the presence of God was not with them, that miracle doesn't happen. If the Ark of the Covenant, which represents God, is not with them in God's presence, I'm not sure that the Jordan River would have stopped in the way that it did so that they could get through. If they tried to sprint through the wilderness and do it at the wrong time against God's plan and His timeline, I'm not sure they get through it. But because they were patient, because they learned lessons, because they walked in the way of God with His timetable, man, what a special moment that these Israelite people get to experience. It's powerful stuff. And what a reminder to the Israelites that God was present with them through the entire wilderness, even through their own rebellion, even through their own planning, even through their own desire. God says, I was with you. And what I want to do today is remind you that in this marathon that we call life, it's dumb for us to try to sprint through it to the finish line. Because when we're sprinting, we don't really think about much else. But when we slow down the pace, it allows us opportunities to see the things around us, see the blessings around us, and recognize and remember that God is with us. And so I hope today that you remember that. I hope that you remember that God is with you, even in this marathon that we call life. You know, you never arrive early or you never arrive late when you're walking in the way of God. I heard that recently. God has you right where you need you. Slow down the pace, be patient, be faithful where you are, and allow God to work. That's what He did with those Israelites at the Jordan River. He said, let me help you. If not, they would have been stuck for up to possibly 2 months at flood stage. But because God was with them, He was able to do immeasurably more than all they could ever understand, ask, or imagine. And so slow down the pace. You don't have to have it all figured out yet. I'm 27, I'm telling myself that because I thought at this age I would have it all figured out, and I don't. And I'm realizing that I may not ever. But slow down. Pay attention to the opportunities around you. Be faithful. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Marathon can be hard, but know that God is with you. Know that God is with you. So quit sprinting. It's a dumb way to run a marathon. It's a dumb way to go about life. God rested. It's okay to rest. It's okay to learn in the midst of those things as well. It's okay to learn at mile 10. It's okay to learn at mile 15. It's okay to learn back at mile 5. Learn and grow. Because when we get to the finish line of life, my prayer is that we didn't go ahead of God's plan and try to do things on our own, but we were walking in step with Him, which allowed us to pay attention to the important things in life. And so finish well now by going slow, so that when you complete the finish line, you do exactly what God had for your life. Hey, we'll see you next month.